Good evening. I'm Hector Avalos from the Religious Studies program and director of the U.S. Latino Studies program. I'm also a member of the Jewish Studies Committee, which has a mission in part to present educational events pertaining to Jewish history and culture. We have sponsored events in the past on Jewish art and on the excavations at Bethsaida in Israel. Tonight we have another exciting speaker. And before introducing him, let me just thank our co-sponsors, the Center for American Intercultural Studies, the Committee on Lectures, funded by GSB, the Greenlee School of Journalism and Communications, the LAS College, including the Miller Lecture Funds and Jewish Studies Committee, and the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Leonard Greenspoon, who holds the Philip M. and Ethel Klutznick Chair and is Professor of Classical and Near Eastern Studies and Theology at Creighton. I have known him for about 18 years, and I have learned that you don't just listen to Dr. Greenspoon, you experience Dr. Greenspoon. Dr. Greenspoon was born in Richmond, Virginia, and he received his BA at the University of Richmond. He received his PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard, where he studied under one of the greatest living biblical scholars, Frank Moore Cross. He specialized in the text of the book of Joshua. He is a textual critic. So if you're dying to know about why a particular word in a verse in Joshua is missing a mater lectionis, please mob him after the lecture. While translation has been a prime focus of his scholarly work, he has a wide array of interest, as reflected in articles on, for example, the Jews of South Carolina, fairy tales, the ethical dimensions of being a parks recreational professional, and effective ways to grade student essays. In recent years, he has become increasingly interested in religion and popular culture, and he has published an article on the Bible in comic strips. A popular speaker in both general and academic audiences, he has made presentations throughout the U.S., Great Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Romania, the Czech Republic, Finland, Israel, and Norway. In fact, I ran into him in Norway back in '98. Tonight he speaks to us on media mediating the Torah. It's a double entendre there. How the media portrays Jewish culture and Hebrew Bible. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Leonard Greenspoon.
Thank you, Hector. Sometimes I sit and listen to introductions and I say, boy, that's a great speaker, and then I realize it's me. And I just hope that I can live up to those very kind words and to the number of different organizations that were part of sponsoring this. I actually like people to interact and participate. I've been to many lectures where a speaker starts by saying, I'm going to talk and you may interrupt me. Interrupt is not a friendly word, and I want this to be friendly. I remember I was giving a lecture on Jews in the comic strips. This is not Jews in the comic books. That's another entire area. It's Jews in the comic strips. Not so long ago, and as I was giving the lecture, you're probably wondering where Jews show up in the comic strips, but that's for another time. But as I was talking, I said, does anybody think of another Jewish character in a comic strip? And someone said, if you don't know comic strips, you won't know what I'm talking about. If you know comic strips, you will. Lovey Saltzman in For Better or Worse. Some of you know For Better or Worse? Okay, For Better or Worse is by universal acclaim the best comic strip for lots of reasons. So there's this character named Lovey Saltzman. I hadn't thought about it. So since we live in the age of email, I sent an email to the cartoonist, Lynn Johnston. She's a Canadian. And she wrote me back. I'll never forget this. She said, Lovey Saltzman was born a Catholic Polish woman. This is called backstory, I understand. and she created a backstory. I think all artists do this. She married a Jewish man and moved to Canada. Her husband died, and she returned to the practice of Catholicism. So indeed, people, it would be interesting, but again, for another lecture, why it was that people recognized something Jewish about her. But that only came to me from the interaction of the audience. So it really is a cooperative venture. One day I want to do a study of titles. You may have noticed the titles are sometimes the best part of some presentations, hopefully not this. Now, the media and the Bible, because I'll be using the Torah generally speaking at this moment for the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, it is actually a huge topic, and we're not going to talk about all of it. I was privileged to speak to one of Hector's classes today, and he told me to talk about myself. Boy, you know, what professor doesn't want to do that? And talk about my work. Often they're an extension of each other. And I mentioned that, and I'll talk about it here a bit too. I write a column in a magazine called Biblical Archaeology Review. I used to write it for Bible Review, which is a sister publication, but it's now defunct. So I write a column. It's called Bible in the News, which got me interested in the ways in which the Bible shows up in the popular press. Now, we may have here, because I know that you have a distinguished school of journalism, and I was interviewed just the other day by a student. It was a wonderful experience on the telephone. And I'm not a specialist in journalism, but I know that Omaha has what's called one of the highest penetration rates in the country. And that sounds awfully racy or something, but it refers to what the percentage of homes in Omaha, Nebraska get the daily newspaper, the World Herald. And it's huge, and I've seen it in my neighborhood. In my experience, there are fewer people reading the newspaper under 30 than there probably are fingers on my hand. Well, that's got to be an exaggeration. But few of our students read print paper anymore. They read it online. I read the New York Times 6 days a week and the World Herald 6 days a week, the New Yorker and a bunch of other things, and I read them the old-fashioned way, even though I do a lot of my research now on the internet. And I'm particularly interested then in what we used to call print media, but I guess now we call it print and electronic media. Oops, too fast. So I wouldn't say that I have a thesis, but I would say that I have a perspective or an approach. In general, the media portrays the Bible in a one-dimensional way. In doing so, it reflects and promotes a view of being biblically literate as more or less equivalent to being proficient in biblical trivia. Now, I'll give you an example outside of the media. Right now, there is a biblical literacy project. Some of you may know about it. There are two competing projects in the country right now to introduce the teaching of Bible in public schools as a subject which would be appropriate for public schools. There's one based in Texas, and there's this one I think is based in Arlington or Alexandria, Virginia. In my opinion, this is the better of the two. In order to prepare for this, they did a survey sponsored by the Gallup organization, or run by the Gallup organization, of biblical literacy. And in order to determine biblical literacy, they asked such questions as, who were the first couple? Who killed Abel? What happened at Cana? Which of the following is in the Sermon on the Mount? This is what I call biblical trivia. If you can name for me the presidents of the United States, something which I probably had to learn in the old days, and as my children keep telling me, of course, there were so many fewer presidents in those days. I don't think that you're literate in the American political system. This is information which is on the one hand trivial, and on the other hand something which if you are a specialist you probably learn. So there's not a commonly agreed definition of what biblically literate is, but what it seems to be coming down to in practice is whether you are really good at Bible trivia. And I think the press reflects this, and it promotes it. At the same time, because I'm an eternal optimist, the media rarely fails to entertain, and will be showing you things which I find entertaining, and with some effort can be harnessed into an efficient tool for interpreting, applying, and expanding upon the Bible. And I think that the biblical text cries out for interaction with us. And when I use the term one-dimensional, another way perhaps of expressing it is literal, but I'm not really concerned about whether someone has promotes a literal reading of the text or not. The biblical text it's in and of itself multidimensional. And I find any view or any approach which tries to limit it to be one that I don't like. I try to be descriptive and not evaluated, but I just don't like that particular kind of view. And it's not limited, by the way, to fundamentalists or to literalists. Anyway, because part of the lectureship is sponsored by Jewish Studies, and I decided we would follow in the Jewish order of the books. There's no reason to think that the Jewish order of the books is the original order. Truth is, we don't know what the original order of the books of the Bible would be, if there was, in fact, an original order. So the first group of books, the word Torah, which I used in the title, can be most specifically used to refer to the 5 books of Moses, sometimes translates law, sometimes instruction. This is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It forms the bulk of the interest in the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition, and forms the bulk of interest in the media presentations. It is also called the Pentateuch from the Greek, and it's also called the 5 books of Moses. Okay, so what I will do is to go through the text in order and just show you some examples of things I like and things I don't like, things I think are funny, things I think are sort of painful, and maybe we can even agree that on which we think is which. Okay, this comic is called Frank and Ernest. I don't know if you get this comic strip. It happens to be my favorite, but I can't get them to do it in Omaha. So in the old comic strips, of the older generation of comic strips, which is probably the middle generation of comic strips, this was the only one that portrayed God. There are some others now that I read 160 comic strips a day online now. You got to keep up with the business. In fact, I haven't read them for today yet, so if I don't read them, I have 320 for tomorrow. So the portrayal of God is a guy who's really not omnipotent or omniscient. He's constantly wondering about things. He's always consulting his angels and wondering, maybe I could have done it better or done it differently. There are comic strips that sometimes elicit some public outcry, but as far as I can tell, this one hasn't. Now, this is a more modern example. When I say modern, I mean it's from the last 2 years. Intelligent design was easy. It's an intelligent maintenance program that's difficult. Now, right down the front row is one of the most knowledgeable men in Iowa or in the Midwest or even larger on intelligent design. So it's a comment that then led me to go back to my files, which now I'm trying to put into an electronic form. This actually comes from the Washington Post in 1999, but guess what? This could have been not that long ago. And God said, let there be light in Kansas, seeing the evolutionary light. We have to assume, one of my assumptions is that the writers of the stories that we look at, the news stories or the feature stories, the editors who make sure that the story meets whatever the criteria are for publication, and the unsung heroes in my story, the headline writers. I don't have any headline writers. I don't know if they teach headline writing in journalism school. Probably not. I've talked to many headline writers. They're almost always frustrated, but I'll show you some great headlines. Nonetheless, we, I think, are safe in assuming that the newspaper powers that be assume that the readers will understand the reference. It's a fairly easy reference. And God said, let there be light. And then it's particularly apposite because of the topic under discussion. Now, this is just one of the new comic strips I've been introduced to recently. It's actually called the comic strip with 3 punchlines because, in fact, it's a comic strip with 3 punchlines. So I'm guessing that most people will recognize what the scene is. Did you know apples are an excellent source of vitamin C? Forbidden. The only thing that's forbidden are these low prices. Apples go great with ribs. Okay. Now, we can stop there. Or, since I've suggested we can use most anything in the process of learning, and note that the fruit mentioned in the biblical text is not specified as an apple. In fact, I've been told apples didn't grow in that area at that time, but of course that assumes there was a time and there was an area. Nonetheless, were we to follow this through, we could go to the translations that first used apple, and then we can go to apple of my eye. We can go lots of different ways with it. And of course, we can talk about ribs. I found out recently, this is a little bit scary. Do you have a Tony Roma's here? You know it's a ribs place. Have you ever heard of its chain? More than 50%, and this I got out of reading the media, more than 50% of the people who go to Tony Roma's think that men have one less rib than women. More than 50%. 80% of the people that go to Tony Roma's knew that ribs usually come from pork. This is a little bit it's a little bit intriguing what you can learn from the press. Now you might say Tony Roma's is not representative, but I have a feeling probably is. Now, if sex has lost its shock value, how about God? There was a show done by a writer named Paul Rudnick. It was a Broadway show, The Most Fabulous Story Ever Told. And I don't know if any of you saw it, I don't know if it traveled, but the point about it was that instead of Adam and Eve, yes, it was Adam and Steve. And we certainly could use something like this, although they don't, to begin a serious discussion. I haven't done enough in my classes over the years of making use of some of this material pedagogy. I've started to introduce it more and more. But a lot of this material, even where I think it's somewhat superficial, and not all of it is, it lends itself to some more intense discussion. Now, I asked a student the other day if it happened to be a he, knew who Methuselah was. He didn't know who Methuselah was. He didn't know that Methuselah came from the Hebrew Bible. But he did know that there was something about Methuselah which suggests long life. A series of these has led me to hypothesize or conjecture that a lot of the references to the Bible that I find are being missed by many readers. I'm not even sure that one of my favorites, as you'll see in a little while, as wise as Solomon, that people actually know that Solomon is a biblical figure. I hesitate to even ask if they know what it means to be as rich as Croesus. They may think that's a biblical feature as well. But there's no, the subheading is science can make us Methuselahs at a price. There's no reason why we can't point out that Methuselah, according to the Hebrew text, or according to the biblical text in Genesis, was the longest lived person at 969 years, which will then, of course, lead to a good discussion of what years may have meant, what numbers in the Bible may have meant, what days may have meant. Not that we would come up with something which would be conclusive, but something which would be at least illuminating. And of course, we could then compare those lives with lists of kings from the Mesopotamian era, which went into the thousands of years, not their lives, but simply their reigns, and begin to ask questions. One of the questions which I don't think is asked enough about the biblical material is the question of genre. To say, what kind of material is are the first 2 chapters of Genesis, or the first 10 chapters of Genesis? The answer is not obvious. The answer would not be agreed upon by everyone. But a lot of the way we read almost any piece of literature is determined by our understanding. It's fiction, it's nonfiction, what it is. I was interested. I've known Hector for 18 years, but I'm finding we have a lot of interests that I didn't know we had in common. So I just finished writing an article for the Creighton magazine on humor in the Bible, where I started with a scene where a judge, one of the biblical judges, puts a dagger in a king, it's a very fat man, and pulls it out. And it takes verse after verse and describes it in clinical detail. And then I'm making the case that this is funny. Not funny in a sense that we might immediately recognize. And then Hector was reminding me of an article he'd written on humorous aspects of the book of Daniel. Again, a book you might not associate immediately with humor. But there's a lot there. Yes, the good news is the rain stopped. The bad news, you're not covered by flood insurance. Now, immediately, we think, now this is very interesting. I'm guessing that there's hardly a soul alive who doesn't know the expression Noah's Ark. Okay, I've worked on, as Hector mentioned, some Bible translations. One of them is the Contemporary English Version. It's a good, sort of modern, updated language version produced by the American Bible Society. One of the things that they, along with the Good News Bible, which came earlier, try to avoid is quote-unquote technical biblical language. So they will not say Noah's Ark, Noah's big boat. And I've sent them cartoon after cartoon. I said, look, it's right there, everybody knows it. But it gets to the Ark of the Covenant, it's something like the container with the really important agreement or something. There's a big debate in Bible translation over how much you can assume your reader knows, but I think we can assume our reader probably knows the word ark. Now, in another context, you could probably imagine something like this. Were you really on Noah's Ark, wise sage? Sure. In fact, I almost didn't go because of the crowds. No, because FEMA kept telling everyone not to worry over a few clouds. One of my interests, although I don't do political cartoons per se, but if any of you read comic strips, you know the old term funny papers just really doesn't apply. Most of them are not funny exactly. Few of them are actually for children. Still got Peanuts and Family Circus and a few others. But all kinds of things are going on in the comic strips. And I would say of the 160 I'm reading online and the 10 I still have to read in print, no more than 15% or maybe 20%, maybe 25% would be understood by children. So there's a lot of politicizing going on. Now, this particular one is part of a series which will show up periodically. A couple of years ago, I got really upset. You can see I probably get really upset about a lot of things. But I got upset this time because there were articles in the newspapers about topics where you would think a biblical scholar would be asked his or her opinion. And they weren't. And this is one of those examples. This is actually when they found some finds in the Black Sea that made them think about that could be Noah's Ark or what have you. They interviewed geologists. They interviewed Mesopotamian scholars because there are Mesopotamian connections. But I was quite concerned to see, and I have some other examples, that in an article dealing with the flood, wouldn't they ask some biblical scholar, well, what are the different views among biblical scholars on how to understand the flood? Is it always taken literally? Is it taken figuratively? And a variety of other things. It didn't happen then. It's happening a little bit more now. But I gave that talk I was giving, I think it was in Denver. After I finished, a geologist came up to me, and a couple of other people came up to me, and they said they had the same complaint in their fields. So I'm not sure if this is a specifically biblical scholars' complaint or not. Now, I have given up on the tabloids. I'll tell you why. Number one, two reasons why I've given up the tabloids. Number one, I used to read them in the lines at the grocery stores. But there are no lines in the grocery stores anymore. I don't know where you go, but I can't find lines in where you can check yourself out, or you're out so fast you haven't got time to read them. And what self-respecting person is going to buy it? Well, I must have bought this one. The other thing about the tabloids is their business has been taken over. Almost everything of interest in the tabloids will show up in the New York Times, but the New York Times will say, as reported in the tabloids, pardon us, and then they'll tell you there's hardly any reason for tabloids. But back in 98, 99, I was into tabloids, and this is one of the things, the sequence of Noah's tomb. Presumably, they have Noah being buried with his ark. Day of Judgment ends with a giant 1998 flood. Guess we missed that. And then, so I'm reading that, and then I'm wondering why you have the last notice here. Tree sap holds the key to curing all diseases. If we're going to die in the next 6 months, why do we need to? Well, I've never understood this. Now, here we have, this comic strip is called Fuzz. It's rather, you'll see some comic strips are rather verbal. The balloons are filled. He called me an atavistic Nimrod. You don't hear that every day. Nimrod was a biblical figure known for his hunting prowess. Really, it sounded like an insult. Believe me, Mr. Hacker, you're one of the most benighted people I know. That's better, thank you. My bad, I was being perspicacious. Okay, this comic strip features... Now, how many times are you going to find the reference to Nimrod? I might have preferred, as Charles Schultz did regularly in Peanuts, actually telling you where it's found. But then again, these days, you could go online and find that. Mostly, the articles, the comic strips, the media, deals with well-known events, ones that they feel would be immediately recognizable. And frequently, when they don't, they give us at least a hint of what's being sought after. I simply put this here because it reminds us that some of the ritual proscribed and prescribed in the Hebrew Bible is still around. Of course, the circumcision as a sign of the covenant made with Abraham is very important. This particular article deals with a practice among some in the ultra-Orthodox groups where the moil, or the man who's performing the circumcision, sucks the blood from the baby's penis rather than doing something else. And it has been associated with herpes, and you would not be surprised that in the city of New York, this is a hot political issue. Apparently, as far as I know, it still hasn't been decided. It's not whether or not circumcisions are bad or good. It's another issue. It's not whether or not their health or anything else. It's this particular issue. But it reminds us that the Hebrew Bible, in many ways, is a living document. Frank and Ernest again. Be careful with Miss Smith's fur. She tried 6 other companies before coming to us. A coat of many coolers. Okay. I have yet to find another company. I mean, we have popular culture with Joseph and the amazing Technicolor, but we have all of that. But I've yet to find another reference to Joseph and the coat of many colors. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't it the case that the translation or the interpretation of the coat as having many colors is problematic, and it may indeed be something else? Well, yes, indeed. And so those of you who are thinking that and trying to think of how you would introduce it into the class, this could be a way of doing it. Lord Jehovah Yahweh. God is known by many different names, depending on the religion and the language. Yes, and when he's up in heaven, he's called Art. Art? Yes, Grandma, from the prayer, Our Father who art in heaven. No, Ruthie, how would be his name? Now, I have a series of these that come primarily from Family Circus. The issue here is partly one of translation, but it's also partly the way in which we deal with the Tetragrammaton. Or we can simply allow that it's funny, but it's substantive at the same time. This is Ruthie's comic strip called Ruthie. It's not one that I actually like, but there's a lot of issues about the name of God that this could be a portal for. Pre-Exodus pranks, smite me. Okay, I felt I just couldn't much do without that. Of all the bushes in the entire desert, why did I have to go and try to leave my mark on the one that was burning? Contrary to popular belief, not all dogs go to heaven. Now, I have a sub-collection on comic strips dealing with heaven and hell. Unlike what I understand to be the case in medieval churches, where the stained glass windows dealt primarily with hell, because it's much more, first of all, it's more of a cautionary note, and it was much more interesting to portray all the evils of hell than the wonderful life of heaven. In the comic strips, it splits, because they can actually find a lot of things about heaven which are less than heavenly. But this actually is only leading us to my very favorite, all-time favorite, I know it's almost 10 years old, headline. Now, this is Maureen Dowd, columnist. She writes, as you probably know, she's a syndicated columnist for the New York Times. Now, when a column comes to, in this case, to the World Herald, it got a different headline. Searing sound spout. That may be too alliterative for you. From a burning bush. And what are they talking about? And why do I think it's so funny? So clever? When the first President Bush had his library dedicated in Austin, which was in 1997, the then President Clinton came and made some remarks which the then governor, now President Bush, took exception to. And breaking with what was supposed to be a thought of a fun, slap everybody on the back afternoon, he made some rather caustic remarks. Hence, searing sound spout from a burning bush. Now, I like that. To me, it's clever, it's alliterative, and it's biblically redolent. He's a divider, not a uniter. Now, this is interesting in a sense because without any identification, we know who this is. Oh, and we assume that most everybody does. I've sort of given up on assuming that everybody knows any particular thing, but that most people would know who this is. And of course, were we to move a step beyond, we could talk about the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, so on and so forth. Manna in the form of jobs comes to the reservation. Just hold this for a moment because I want to talk about manna later. But it actually reminds me that my daughter, a younger daughter, was a student at NYU. She graduated last year. And she was in a college called the Gallatin School of Individualized Study. They don't have anything as mundane as majors. They take seminar after seminar. So she sent me one day, she was taking a seminar about J-O-B. And I said, oh, thank goodness you're going to get a job. Nope. Was studying about Job. So I was rather when you went back there, if you were very biblical, you might have thought it was manna in the form of Job's comes to the reservation. Okay, we're not going to talk much about Val Kilmer in the Ten Commandments or any of the many movies or films that have been presented. I've written a couple of columns in the Bible and the News about this. By and large, although we've seen a couple of exciting films about the New Testament, I don't think we've seen very many about the Hebrew Bible. And have you noticed this? You would have seen the same thing if you watched the miniseries called Rome that was on HBO. That in all of these series, if you're an upper class person, you speak like you're from Oxford. And if you're a lower class person, you have a Cockney accent. That seems to be it. And none of these almost all the actors who have anything to say are British, and they're either upper class or not. And the idea of bringing in almost anybody else is almost unheard of. There was a show a couple of years ago about Noah's Ark, and right in the middle of Noah's Ark, who comes by but the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah? Excuse me. And one of these shows was introduced with a comment: "We have taken poetic license with the Bible." and I wrote back. I wrote in my column that they might one day think of hiring someone with a PhD or THD to help them if they want something close to verisimilitude. Although when they did, what was it called? The one that Steven Spielberg did, The Prince of Egypt. He apparently had 125 PhDs, THDs, rabbis, ministers, priests, and others working on it. Maybe they're best not to use too many. Sorry, you are only allowed one carry-on item per passenger. I guess there all you need to know is Roman numerals. Although, again, were we to take this a little bit further, we would realize that it's not every tradition that has 5 commandments and 1 tablet and 5 commandments. It's a Jewish tradition, but in many Christian traditions, they divide up differently, just in the numeration. Their laws, Moses, use legal-sized tablets. I had collected literally dozens dealing with the 10 Commandments. It's one of the 2 or 3 most popular topics. Now, we learn in where we read in the 10 Commandments that the sins of the parents can be visited on the child. I've always tried to weasel my way out of it. Ezekiel finally makes it very clear that we are punished or rewarded for what we do and not what anybody before or after us does. Nonetheless, the sins of the child being visited upon the parent, which has to do with children who misbehave and the parents go to jail, is a clear biblical reference. Now, the headline writer knew that. It's not in the story itself, but the headline writer knows. Now, this is a very interesting case. On abortion, it's the Bible of ambiguity. This comes from, it refers to the passage in Exodus 21, where a woman is injured while breaking up a fight, and it says she miscarries, which is the way I had always learned it, or she gives birth prematurely. It makes a difference, because the next thing says that there would be a fine or a penalty, a non-lethal penalty for the person who does that. Then it goes an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Now, if it says that it's a miscarriage, it suggests that the fetus, while not insignificant, is not at the level of a life. Because for life, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, a life for life. If it's a premature birth, as conservative Christians take it, and then nothing more happens, that's okay. But if then something else happens, they're not talking about the value of the fetus. Now, this article does an excellent job in sorting through all that. And here we have just a little violence among enemies. Hockey has a biblical aura. An eye for an eye is just part of the game. I don't know necessarily that's a biblical aura. A political cartoon recently, after Prime Minister Sharon suffered his stroke, and from this height he saw the promised land. And we can think of Moses on Mount Nebo looking into the promised land. That's one of the political. Now we look at the prophets. My greatest fear about commitment is that the woman I love will discover my weaknesses and zap my power, just like Delilah did to Samson, metaphorically speaking. Now, this assumes then you got to know about Samson and Delilah in a comic strip. This is an interesting example of something I talked about before. Samson diagnosis, a little bit of Latin there, antisocial personality disorder with muscles. This was an article that appeared in the New York Times and elsewhere where 7 psychiatrists in California sat down over lunch, read the account of Samson, and diagnosed him. Okay, the New York Times picked up the story and then talked to some other psychiatrists and asked them about the diagnosis. Did they ever think to go to a biblical scholar and say, what do biblical scholars think about Samson? How do they understand it? No, we were left out in the cold. Okay, David and Goliath is a very popular theme, even when we're talking about, as we are right here, we're talking about Barnes & Noble versus Amazon.com. Hey, I'm not seeing a David there. But David and Goliath, of course, is not just a matter of size. It's almost always, it's not just one's bigger and one's smaller, but the smaller one has justice on his side and sometimes is referred to even as having God on his time. And in advertisements, go David, go Goliath. Now, this leads to another example. Was Goliath, after all, just a pushover? So now someone discovered that the reason Goliath was killed so easily was that he had a hormonal problem. Now, did anybody wonder about how the biblical scholars understand it? Did anybody really wonder about the fact that the biblical story of David and Goliath is retold with David killing someone else, is retold with someone else killing Goliath? We can deal with all of that, but not on the basis of this, because they didn't ask any biblical scholars. Solomon's Island. This was Ellis Island a few years ago when they were trying to determine who was the rightful owner. And someone then wrote a letter because the New York Times was suggesting that the way to do it was to divide it. The person pointed out that, of course, Solomon really didn't want to divide that baby. He wanted to give it to its rightful owner. This is one of my favorites because it makes no sense at first. Glenn Birnbaum, the Solomon of Bistro seating, dies at 76. He had a restaurant called Mortimer's in New York. That's where all the cool people hung out. When he died, notice he's got the whole top of a page in the New York Times. You don't get that for nothing, right? It's usually kings, potentates, and so forth. He was a fixture. What does this mean? It means that when Jackie Kennedy came in one day, and her cousin Lee Radziwill, and maybe Babe Paley, and a few of the other, big names, and they all needed seats, he could find a seat for every one of them. Hence, he was the Solomon of Bistro seating. At first, I thought that was lavish and overstated, but think about Solomon. He probably would have appreciated that. Now, this same Glenn Birnbaum precipitated one of the great references to the New Testament in the New Yorker. I'm sorry, I have a photographic memory, so all this stuff is just in my head. It just comes out because I don't have it here. I think his name is John Richardson. He's a very famous art historian. Used to eat at Mortimer, so he's reporting after Glenn Birnbaum died in the Taste of the Town section. I used to go to Mortimer's, he said, and this guy would come up. It was Glenn Birnbaum. He was really obnoxious until one day, just like Paul on the road to Damascus, my eyes were opened and I saw just how great Glenn Birnbaum was. Now, it's amazing. We can probably get seats there now. Well, we'll do this very quickly. Snuffy Smith, I only put it in here because we get the Queen of Sheba there. And I don't find a lot of references to the Queen of Sheba on the street these days. Plowshare or sword. A reference to a twice found passage in the prophets. Turn your swords into plowshares. Of course, there's also the passage, turn your plowshare into swords. But it's very clear that the headline writer here believes that we'll be able to figure out the reference. The voice crying in the wilderness, Isaiah chapter 40, then picked up in the New Testament, is coming from the driver who took the wrong exit off the freeway. It's from a comic strip that's called Graffiti. Lions sleep with the lambs, but grudgingly. This is a serious column about some serious art, and it does make reference to the passage in Isaiah 11, the prophecy of the lions and the lambs. And so one could even just by reading this, get some enlightenment. Residents say there is balm. Got to be very careful about balm. I guess that's the way you pronounce it. In Gilead. This is a world hero story about a city called Gilead in Nebraska. This is a passage out of Jeremiah. It actually quoted at the beginning, so you can get a sense of where the reference is coming from. I like this. Indeed, it deals with healing in this community which had been divided. And then the reference, that's one I happen to like. And great swarms of locusts, this is frogs talking, filled the sky and covered every inch of ground as far as the eye could see. It was a time of great bounty and joy. This is what we teach sometimes. What was the Exodus like from the point of view of the Egyptians? How did the Canaanites feel about these Israelites coming into their land? Different point of view. So we hadn't really thought too much about the different point of view of the locusts, but we've begin to use this. Did you ever read the biblical story about Jonah? What made you think of a dumb thing like that? I've only found 3 references to Jonah in all the years, and they're all as lame as this one. But nonetheless, there it is. And in fact, many biblical scholars, you have to really be a biblical reader, would say the book of Jonah is very, very funny. And when we say it's very, very funny, it's not to say it's not serious. I mean, it doesn't mean it's not carrying serious messages, but it's a funny text. The last part of the Hebrew Bible, the Ketuvim, includes Proverbs, Psalms, Ecclesiastes, Job, a Song of Songs, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Now, this is a little bit long. Republicans are trying to make inroads with blacks by giving black churches tons of cash. All through the White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. Susan, I think they've got to Reverend Wilfred. This is an ongoing theme in this comic strip called Canterville. Come on, isn't that a bit paranoid, Lamont? What? And yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no liberal. Advisors apply biblical lessons to religious financial planning. Now, the quote here is actually one from Romans, but I've seen other articles where they quote from Proverbs. Observe the ants, see what the ants do. And just as there are a number of diets based on the Bible, but in fact, there's one diet based on the Bible, which is vegetarian. There's another diet based on the Bible, which is eat as much meat as you can. There's one plan here to make a lot of money, but presumably all the plans intend that the money go mainly to the Lord. Blah, 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 blah. A fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing an opinion. Proverbs 18:2. This is very much the kind of things that the very kind of thing Charles Schulz used to do in Peanuts. As we see, look, I just earned $1. The first dollar I ever earned. I'm going to have it framed and hang it on a wall in my room. I'll have it put in a nice frame with glass over it, and I'll hang it up, and I'll keep it for the rest of my life. A fool and his money are soon parted. Now there Schulz didn't put the reference. That's another verse of Proverbs. Often he did. Church whippings investigated. This is a very serious. So some of those are not very serious. Over the last few years, a number of churches, alas, mostly in the South, have been investigated, and often charges brought by child welfare departments because of the brutality inflicted on the children. And many times they've said, well, what does it say in the Bible? Spare the rod, spoil the child. And I've read many articles on the topic. I've never seen one discussion of, well, is that really what it says in Proverbs? Is there any context to it? No discussion of that. There may be no discussion. We won't know it until we actually have it. As it is, these articles leave me wanting more. Murder suspect changed his name to Job. This is Job. This is a guy convicted of murder who became a Christian, that's what he says, and they decided to change his name to Job because, like Job, he felt he was being persecuted. Go figure. Here is a political ad, an open letter to President Bush concerning America's clean air by 95 Christian leaders, which bases itself on Job 12:10. Very interesting. It's not a passage which may come to mind to a lot of people. This is William Safire. William Safire is a conservative columnist for the New York Times. He is also extraordinarily biblically literate, by which I mean he knows his Bible, he knows how to apply it, he knows how to interpret it. So this is after the Katrina flood. And he quotes from the book of Job, "Canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook?" Talking about one of the mythical sea creatures, talking about the power of God, and then asking, where was God? These references aren't always answers to the questions. They're often, further considerations of the questions. But William Safire is very good about that, even though I don't like his politics. I'm sorry, no political statements. Tell me again, why do you need a goat and a monkey? This is a commenter called Agnes. Very strange. Because we are going to do something worthwhile this summer. Just as the good book saith, all worthwhile things under the sun shall beginneth with thy goat and thy monkey. Well, presumably this is under the sun from Ecclesiastes. There's a time for everything. Now, I did a column once on a time for everything. It turns out that in some cases, it's a time for peace. And in other cases, the political rhetoric has, it's a time for war. Well, again, this is from the book of Ecclesiastes or Kohelet, one of the most difficult books of the Hebrew Bible. And the use of the Bible in political rhetoric is something which we are seeing more of. And if you think that political rhetoric using the Bible is a quote-unquote conservative phenomenon only, just Friday, Hillary Clinton, no matter what you think about it, she ain't a conservative, said in referring to the legislation which would criminalize helping out illegal aliens, which the Catholic Church is much opposed to, she said that if that passes, this bill would criminalize the Good Samaritan and criminalize Jesus himself. Them's fighting words. Cast your bread upon the waters. I'll tell you the truth. I thought for years that was from the Sermon on the Mount. I should have known, of course, it's from Ecclesiastes, part of the Hebrew Bible. One of the most popular trends throughout literature, using the term very broadly, is a graphic novel. There's a manga, I guess, but lots of graphic novels, and we're finding more and more graphic novels on the Bible now. When I say more and more, I mean there used to be none, and now there are more than a dozen. Originally, as I understand it, they were used primarily with inner city youth as a target, but now the audience is much more varied and much more literate. Now, what's interesting about the graphic novel, and I've looked at this one in Esther, is if you read the Hebrew Bible, there are a lot of questions left unanswered. You don't know generally why people did what they did. Very little about motivation. Very little about other than the main character, as it were. A lot of peripheral things just sort of go to the periphery. Graphic novels, one of the things that graphic novels do is they fill that in. In the Jewish tradition, this is a form of midrash. And this is a form of visual midrash that will be taken more and more seriously as time goes on. The Dead Sea Scrolls predict second great flood in 1998. Seems like we're going backwards. 1 billion people will perish. Did we miss that? A whole other lecture on the Dead Sea Scrolls. One of the things about these old-fashioned tabloids is that they make up biblical scholars. This is a famous Dr. Martinique. I thought that was a resort somewhere. They are men that look like this, or they're very sexy Italian women with long names, all of whom are made up. The truth is, you could find biblical scholars who would say almost anything. Why do you have to make them up? Final prophecy of the Dead Sea Scrolls. On December 19th, 1999, I remember it well, World War III was started by a woman. And again, they go over it more and more and more about this. Now, very quickly, we've only got a couple more minutes. The column I write for, it's called Bible in the News. It's now published in Biblical Archaeology Review. Biblical Archaeology Review, at its height, had almost 200,000 subscribers. It's down from its height. Now, 200,000 subscribers is not a lot compared to the New York Times or Time Magazine or Newsweek. That's a lot of people in the biblical world. And so I often will fix on a expression and then try to find references to it and then try to work it into an article. Now, I just remembered, I went over to, Hector invited me to his house. He has this lovely thing at his house where you sign, he has a guest book so he can remember who was there. And also, if anything's missing, he knows where to find me. He knows who took it. And I had to put the date down. And I realized today, I should have known because the first slide said this, today's March 27th. Well, March 27th is the deadline for my article, for my next article to the Biblical Archaeology Review, which means I may not be able to get it, or I may just work halfway through the night. I know there are no students here who would put off things to the last minute and then have to work halfway through the night. Anyways, I decided to make mana the topic. And so now I cheat a little bit now, and I use the LexisNexis database. Well, this is just what some of my columns look like. We'll get through this quickly. I used to be limited to 400 words. Then I got up to 800 words. They pay me the same no matter what. Then I get 1,000 words sometimes. Anyway, so I go to the LexisNexis database. So trying to find references to manna from heaven. So the manna from heaven is first described as bread. It's going to be bread from heaven. And then manna, what is it? Then it's manna. So this article, which comes from the London Daily Telegraph, in the context of an article, a larger article about shrubbery, the British love shrubbery, does actually talk about where, according to some scientists, manna may come from. We think it's real, what could actually have produced it. This is what I call sort of a substantive sort of article. Then we look at different ones. Here's a bakery in Australia. The Australians have wonderful source of articles for me. Manna from heaven biscuits. Well, there you see, you've got the heaven, you've got the bread, you've got a lot of the biblical imagery that comes out of that. And then you have, this is very touching, manna from heaven in Darfur, where people continue to be senselessly slaughtered and nobody seems to know what to do about it or be willing to do anything about it. So we have the image of the planes coming by and dropping food. And the reference to manna from heaven seems very, very appropriate. And then we have movie franchises as manna from heaven, because they tend to be very marketable. But the one that's chosen here, The Lion, the Witch, and the Christian Right, the Narnia series, so that has sort of a religious reference to it. But they don't have to. The forecast, some rain with areas of high profit for malls, theaters, basement repairers, wet weather is good. Rain is manna from heaven for us, says Carney, general manager of a company specializing in waterproofing leaky basements. Some good that comes out of almost anything. I found out, by the way, that everybody in Omaha at some point has a leaky basement. Since we've gone through that, I don't have to go through it again. And finally, banks mistake manna from heaven. This is fascinating. A woman goes to her ATM machine, thinks she has about $12 and $7,800. So she draws it all out and then spends it, and then says, maybe I shouldn't have. Then it turns out she was not exactly an exemplary citizen. She had warrants out for prostitution, for a whole bunch of other stuff. So I thought sort of banks mistake manna from heaven, but a number of other articles where money is found as legislators and other politicians try to balance the budget, and then they call it manna from heaven, but of course that manna was money and it came from us. And then finally, this sort of seemed to me sort of funny, is because it's Boston College, which is a fellow Jesuit school. They're talking about making shots as manna from heaven. So then somehow or another between now and midnight, or I'll probably get a day's extension, I'll put this into a column where I talk about how manna from heaven is used, sometimes appropriately, sometimes less so, and then also give some indication of the story from Exodus 16 and how some usage of it seem more appropriate than others. In conclusion, this is a sampling of a very large topic, namely the Bible, in this case Hebrew Bible, in media. There are certain aspects of this which are of great interest to me. You notice that by and large I'm not interested in stories about displays of Bibles, or I'm interested in how the Bible comes often incidentally in a story or not in a story. I'm interested in the assumptions that are made by the columnist, the writer, the headline writer, and the editor. I'm interested in getting people's reaction to that. And as I said, now I've become very concerned about how this could lead to the sense, which is growing, alas, that being biblically literate simply means knowing a lot of biblical trivia. Thank you very much. We have time for questions, yes? Don't be shy.
I
Yes.
was just wondering, I've always wondered, is the Jewish Bible from Genesis to Malachi?
No, it's a good question. And the question could have been answered differently even a couple of hundred years ago. But in its present form, the order of the Jewish Bible is from Genesis to 2 Chronicles. Now, as I said, in antiquity, there are different orderings for the books of the Bible. And in fact, in the Talmud, which is an important Jewish source from 3rd to 6th century, they list the books in a different order. And certainly up until the development of printing, the books appeared in a different order. No one knows, frankly. I mean, we do know that in all of the traditions I know, there's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua. And then there are differences, and rather significant differences. So that if you choose, as Jack Miles, who is a biblical a student of the Bible at Harvard, older even than me, who then went on to be a writer in the LA Times, written a number of books. When he wrote his Life of God, as I recall, he followed the order of the Hebrew Bible. But if you follow that is the Jewish order. He followed the Christian, he was making God a character in the Bible. But it matters what the order is in that case. Malachi functions beautifully, of course, from the Christian perspective, because it very near the end of the book of Malachi, but chapter 3, verse 1, you have a figure coming who will announce the Messiah. And then you go to Matthew and you have John the Baptist coming, and from the Christian perspective, announcing the Messiah. Now it happens that the contents of the Hebrew Bible and the Protestant Bible, the contents are identical. Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox, and then there are other churches which have even a more expanded. They have an expanded number of books, including Judith and Tobit, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the Wisdom of Solomon, additional material in Daniel, additional material in Esther. It's interesting because all of this material, which is not found in the Jewish Bible, is Jewish in origin. And then the reasons about why it's not, it's a long discussion, inconclusive discussion. But, for example, the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah is told in the books of Maccabees, which are not part of the Jewish Bible. The books of Maccabees, of course, part of the Roman Catholic and Greek Orthodox and Eastern Orthodox religion, but they don't celebrate Hanukkah. So there's a lot of interesting little features there. Thank you. Yes.
What is your read on the depiction of God and the reactions or non-reactions in terms of the idea "Thou shalt have no graven images," and yet these cartoons appear.
That also is a very important question. Within the mainline Jewish tradition, as is true for many Christians, but not for Muslims, you combine so that you would have no graven images and bow down to them. And if they're not for worship purposes, then it's considered to be appropriate. So it's not unusual to find such imagery in synagogues, for example, and in some churches. Now here, I thought that someone might take offense because the pictures of God that appear in Frank and Ernest, or the depiction of God, and the depiction of God that appears in some of the other comic strips, I wouldn't say they're not exactly negative, but they're not exactly. And Far Side used to have some. They're not. Well, they're negative to the extent that your picture of God is omniscient, omnipotent. Why would God then need to be wondering about what he did, and why would he need to be consulting the angels, and why does he always seem to be just incredibly amused and bemused and sometimes even befuddled by all of this? And now some of this, interestingly enough, is in the Hebrew Bible itself. In chapter 6, where God looks at the evil in the world, and as I would read the text literally, God repented of having created the world. This is extraordinary. How could God or even if you put something else there which isn't as strong, so didn't God know this was going to happen? And lots of questions are raised about that. The only comic strip, by the way, that I ever saw a letter about, and this was in Greenville, South Carolina, was it was one of those Sunday, Sunday, the comic strips are longer. They're in color, and they tend to have more panels to them. It was a long Peanuts one where Charlie Brown had a, I can't think of the word, you can get it on your wrist, a growth on your wrist. And I can't think of the term for it now. But something else. It's like a ganglia. I think it has another term. But okay, ganglia. And so Lucy says, in order to get rid of it, you have to hit with ganglia. Hit it with a big book. And so she reaches for one, and says, "Oh, it's a King James. No, it's a New Revised Standard Version. No, it's this one, it's this one, this one." She finally says, "I don't know which one," and hits him with it, and it's The Tale of Two Cities. And someone wrote in, and this is Greenville, South Carolina, and said, "Charles Schulz has committed the ultimate blasphemy against the Holy Spirit." Other than that, I maybe because people don't take comic strips seriously, although they really need to be taken seriously. Not that we drag the fun out of them, but there are all kinds of lessons going on there. And just to give you a quick example, because we've gone through a great deal recently about depictions of the prophet Muhammad, there's a comic strip called BC. It's set in the Stone Age. Some of you may know it. It's drawn by a cartoonist who also draws The Wizard of Id. And he had a cartoon, and I'm blanking on his name right now. It'll come to me, but maybe next week. He had a cartoon on Easter Sunday 3 years ago. Now, he's a conservative Christian, avowedly evangelical Christian, and he often puts scenes in his comic strips that are Christian. And he has, for example, the Easter time had depictions of Jesus on the cross and blood's flowing. That's his faith. He's depicting it. In this comic strip, he had, I started in the first panel with a menorah. Now, this is not the Hanukkah menorah that has the 8 candelabra and the 1 lighting candle. This is the one that appeared in the temple, so it has 7 candles to it. And in each panel of the strip, you watch it, and in each panel of the strip, one of the candelabra burns off. And then at the end, you get a picture of Jesus and messages, a passage from the New Testament. And what he very clearly in comic strip language, because comics, I don't mean funny language, but in cartoon language, he was basically saying that you strip away the menorah, you strip away all the stuff of Judaism that's not important, and what you end up with is Christianity. This is called supersessionism. It has other than triumphalism. It has historically a lot of adherents. The Roman Catholic Church Most mainline Protestant denominations have denied it. But that to be in a cartoon was offensive. So people started protesting, and so I finally got to his, I couldn't get to him. I got to Lynn Johnston, but I got to his syndicator. And he said, boy, if you see the stuff that's there, you should see the stuff we don't let him publish. But he responded by saying that he noticed the menorah one day, and what he was trying to say was that Judaism and Christianity come from the same source. But the way he did it, if that was indeed his purpose, the way he did it just seemed very strange. Now, what's the proper reaction to that? Well, I didn't know this, but you learn some things. The Sunday cartoons go to the newspapers many days in advance. So they've got to be printed up in color. And so people found out about this before. Some people said we shouldn't publish the comic strip, and so on and so forth. That wasn't the right answer. Now, by the way, we may be getting a little far afield, but you may think, are there comic strips which sometimes don't get published? Not editorial comic strips. Yes, I'll give you an example. We'll go back to For Better or Worse. There's a character in For Better or Worse. Again, if you don't know For Better or Worse, you don't know what I'm talking about. Named Lawrence. He's gay. We find that out. He doesn't, you don't have comics where he's hugging his boyfriend or anything. It's noted, and then he goes on and lives his life. Every time Lawrence appears in the comic strip, there are 3 newspapers in Alabama that won't publish it. Don't ask me. So they just say there's a lot of stuff in the daily press. There's a lot of stuff that goes on we sort of take for granted. A lot of it just is below the radar. But these things, to me, these things matter. They matter enough for somebody to write them and illustrate them. They matter enough for somebody to print them. They matter enough for people to read them. And then they matter enough for us to think about. In fact, I used to say that the daily comic strips were like, now this takes me way back, they were like the daily, remember before they had nighttime soap operas. You can remember back that far. It was the daytime soap operas where everything was happening. All of the social issues were discussed there. In a lot of ways, and people didn't know that at that point nobody really cared much about who watched General Hospital or anything else. All my children or whatever they are. Better not mention too many of them. I think I've watched them. But then, they were there and they're sort of below the radar. Then they got to nighttime TV. Some liked it, some didn't like it. A lot of stuff goes on in the comic strips. And I'm talking about before the online comic strips. So there's a lot there. There's a lot of the depictions which I think are fodder for fertile discussion. Further questions? Yes?
Is there some biblical passage that's sort of consistently misinterpreted in the media?
Ooh, that's a good question. Is there any biblical passage which is consistently misinterpreted?
I'm thinking partly maybe of eye for an eye, which is misinterpreted generally.
Right. And that, like, it showed up there in the, I just don't see it that often. I'll tell you one, depending on how you take the Bible, because if you take it as, if you take the Old and New Testament together, then this wouldn't be a misinterpretation. But if you don't, it is. I once did a column on the patience of Job. Now that comes out of the New Testament, the reference to the patience of Job. So you can't say it's being misinterpreted. But in the Hebrew Bible itself, Job is anything but patient. Now you might say, though, that the patience of Job is already just part of our lingo. And so then it comes into the press with that kind of misinterpretation. But I actually went through I must have gone through the alphabet. They didn't like that when I did that. And I would find something like beer makers, an article about beer makers having the patience of Job. Dunkin' Donut salesmen having the patience of Job. Frogmen having the patience of Job. Down to zebra painters having the patience of Job. But let me think if there's any. That's such a good. I mean, it's a good question. Let me think. Well, maybe spare the rod, spoil the child. But I don't know. Maybe the people who are doing it have just taken that text literally. But they don't give us any. They don't give us any context for it. Most of the subject matter comes out of creation, the flood, the Exodus, and the Ten Commandments. But I'll keep thinking about it. There was another question over here? Yes.
In the book of Genesis with Adam and Eve, and the fall and everything, do Jews believe, like Christians, that an original sin, that men are fallen,
Actually, no. Although the practical consequences of the two different beliefs are they're very similar. So sometimes it's said like this, and I think this is a simplification of both beliefs. But Christians believe that all sin because of Adam and Eve, and Jews believe that all sin as Adam and Eve did. So the consequences are that in mainline Jewish belief, there's no perfect person, but that's part of what it is to be human. And actually, but most of the comic strips and most of the references to Adam and Eve never get to that level. But you see how it could lead you to that level, because you probably hadn't thought about that question until you came to this lecture, right? And all of a sudden this lecture made you think of that question. Maybe. It sometimes works that way. Anything else? I think we've got it covered. Thank you very much.